right. On today's MTB Performance Project, we have Coach Lee Taft. Lee is somebody that I respect greatly in the field. He has such a depth of knowledge, both in the educational standpoint, but practically you've coached athletes in so many different capacities and ways. And so, Lee, appreciate you being on the podcast today.
Thanks, Mickey. No, this is exciting. I was thrilled to get connected by a mutual friend of ours to be able to do this, and this will be fun. I'm looking forward to it. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously there's a lot of strength coaches who know who you are in the field. The work that you've done has been instrumental in the development of so many coaches. But for people who don't know who you are and your background, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, no, thank you. So I started out, Mickey, as a phys ed teacher. I was an athlete in college. I played tennis and basketball through college, and got right out of college. I got a phys ed job and started coaching football in the fall, and went to basketball, and then went to track in the spring. Kind of did it all, and then in the summer I went and worked summer basketball camps and tennis and anything, football, whatever. It didn't matter at that time. And this was the later 80s. And so it was a little different. You didn't have, the emphasis on specialization in travel sports. So everybody just kind of did everything. And then around 1991, I wanted to get my master's. I had to get my master's because you have to, if you're going to stay in it, you got 5 years, you got to get it. So I said, I don't know. I don't want to do the nights. I'm working all day. I coach everything. And then to go do classes at night. And so I actually resigned, went full-time down to a place called the United States Sports Academy in Alabama.
Okay.
And I got my master's in sports science and emphasis in strength and conditioning. And I went to, which people know now as IMG, in 91. And I was a strength coach there. And that kind of led me into this journey of kind of what I do now. But it all started as a teacher. I understood teaching, and I think that gave me a really good leg up in the field. And of course, I still coach sports. I'm a head basketball coach right now and doing my training. So just kind of having fun with it.
Yeah, I love it. And like I said, you've gone from working in the private sector, working with athletes, to working with teams, both from the skill side and the strength and conditioning side. So I feel like you've been privy to a lot of different experiences, which I think is important in terms of like understanding athletes and their development. It's not just one aspect you're working with. It's ultimately like a multifactorial thing and approach that I think most coaches should have some exposure to coaching, youth athletes in any specific sport, because it's very different than coaching them in a weight room.
It sure is. And it wasn't too long ago, kind of out of a lot of the programs or courses or things that I've done over the years usually came out of need. People wanted them and they kept asking, and then a couple months. And then I finally said, okay, well, I'll create something, So we did this program called hybrid basketball, basically a hybrid basketball coach. And all it could be hybrid anything, but it was not everybody's lucky enough when they're a basketball coach to have a strength coach. Most high schools don't have it. A lot of small colleges don't even have a strength coach, So it was kind of that. It was like, okay, here are the basics. Here's the basics of basketball, fundamentals. Here's the basics in the weight room and speed development, the fundamentals, 7 patterns, of movement and all that kind of stuff. And I just tried to keep it simple, because the one thing that I have been very fortunate is when I'm training my team, I can train them as their basketball coach. And I need you to be able to do this to execute this offense or defense. But as a strength coach, I also understand, the kind of the nuts and bolts of that. And that kind of helps us a little bit. So yeah, it's been good.
Yeah. And I think, I'd love to get into the frameworks of how you think about athletic development, and in terms of how you're looking at athletes. But, before we got on air and the last couple of weeks, I've been, digesting a lot of the information you've been putting out through podcasts and some of the stuff, like especially your social media. And there's a lot of things that you've been pretty vocal about. And so although I'd love to talk about that stuff, I think right now, currently, there's other more important things going on in youth sports development. And I think it goes beyond just the X's and O's of training. And I think, that's something close to my heart with the young athletes. I have young kids going through, sports development and the coaching that they're exposed to, and not only the training in my facility, but I'd really love to talk today more about like long-term athletic development and where we are currently in the state of that, given specialization, club sports, AAU sports, and all the challenges that brings in the developing of our young athletes.
Yeah, man, I'll tell you, what a great topic to dive into too, because oh gosh, I in our field, and you know this, if we're teaching, like let's say acceleration, we always talk about hold on to that acceleration as long as you can. Like, don't get to top end speed too quick. Hold on, get there because you go, especially if we're talking, longer runs or 60s or up to 100, hold on. Well, that's the way I look at long term athletic development. Hold on to the fundamentals and the foundations as long as you can, because the specialization will come. It just naturally comes. When you start, if I'm an infielder in baseball and I start fielding about, okay, well, that's specific.
Yeah.
I'm already doing it, and I can start that at age 6. But all the other stuff, we got to keep it going. I talk about that in obviously basketball and other sports. I'm like, hold on to that stuff as long as you can. People panic. They're like, oh God, I got to get into specialization. I'm like, no, the gold is in the general athleticism. These great athletes we witness every day on Sunday or during the NBA playoffs and the WNBA start now and Major League Baseball is going on, watching games. And I'm like, hold on to the stuff that allows you to make these great plays later. Because if you cut it too soon, you never get there. So it's like, yeah, hold on to that stuff.
Yeah. And you kind of touched on it, but, and I know it's a bit of a broad and general question, but, if you were to pick apart kind of where the current climate is in like long-term athletic development, maybe from the age, like, young elementary school age up, where would you say some of the biggest, because I think there are, in some ways, the way we're developing athletes, there are some positives, right? I don't want to just come at this from a negative standpoint, right? I think there are ways that I think the system is helping, right? But in your current state of mind, like, where do you think it's hurting our athletes from an earlier stage in terms of their long-term development?
Yeah, no. And first of all, I want to, piggyback on your comment. We know so much more now. We've learned a lot. Science is just think how young our profession is, really. I mean, it really is. It's not very old relative to other professions. We're still strength and conditioning, and this performance stuff we do is what kind of, we're still picking at the lowest hanging fruit. We're still figuring it out. So yeah, we're doing a really, really good job with a lot of things. But what ends up occurring often is we, just as human beings, we're nervous. We're going to fall behind. We're nervous that we're going to get left behind and left out of the loop. So I think what happens is a couple things. Number one is we get bored easily. Not only the athletes, but we do. We're like, okay, I gotta do some more drills, and I just saw this drill on YouTube. I'm gonna do that one too. And what happens is we end up giving athletes things that they're not necessarily, not that it's going to hurt them, but they're just not ready yet. It'd be like, again, I just a little while ago, I just trained a baseball player who's coming off Tommy John, and we're working on stuff with him and going. But it'd be like, taking a really young kid, elementary age kids, and giving them all the different types of pitches, everything you can imagine, before he actually still knows how to hold the ball right and develop their overall strength. And that's what we do in our profession. And it's not that we don't know that, but it's almost human nature. It's like we just can't. We're afraid if the kid gets bored, they're going to leave us. And unfortunately, sometimes that does happen, right? I've had that happen. Parents are like, yeah, I just don't feel like we're going hard enough. I'm like, well, that's, I'm not going to be, culpable for an injury because you're bored. You know what I mean? We're going to do the right thing here. So I think some of that is it. But I do think what we have to understand is if we do a good job in long-term athletic development with creating models of movement, models of training, and then we have diversity amongst those. So like, I'm just going to I talked about acceleration. Gosh, I can think off the top of my head 20 different ways to teach acceleration. I mean, we can do it, different stances and facing different directions and partner chases and get ups and I mean anything, but it's still a foundational pattern of acceleration. We're still doing the basics. So we can make it fun and exciting and different, but it's still a foundational thing. Where we go rogue is when we start doing like too high of an intensity with these
Hmm.
kids and we start putting too high a value on specific techniques and specific like
Yeah.
measurements, because the thing, kids change. Like you're just saying, you got young
Hmm.
kids. Well, they just need to know base. Like if we start giving them too technical of a model at a young age, well, in a month they might grow, become a little less coordinated because they're growing, and now because we put this technical model on them, they're frustrated because they saw their performance go down. We're frustrated because their performance went down, but it was nobody's fault. It just that's why we keep it general. Let it. That's what I said. Hold
Yeah.
on to this stuff as long as you
Yeah.
can.
And, I think that kind of jumps into my next topic, and you kind of segued into it really well. Like I've heard you say, like learning a skill is a very messy process. And I
Yeah.
think, before you expand on that a little bit, and one thing I'm curious is like, why do you think, in your experience, and obviously I have my thoughts, but why do you think coaches and parents, maybe parents, they just don't know any better, but especially coaches, like they just have lost sight of why that's so important, right? Like learning a skill it takes time. And I think, especially when you go back to the young athlete, like we have this expectation that they're going to move like an older, more mature athlete, and that technically they need to be a certain way. And it's not the case. I think if we prioritize certain elements of development, right, like younger age, we have to prioritize speed, velocity, because there's only a certain window that they can develop that. And then, as I've heard you say before, like build speed and velocity, and over time, just gradually work in technical proficiency and those types of things. Can you
Yeah.
can you expand a little bit more on that?
Yeah. That's a really, really good question. And again, I think the development process. Um, Sometimes it gets. I'm gonna jump around a little bit, but sometimes it gets pushed along because when I was a kid, I didn't have pressures to go play in college. It just was, if you did, you did. If you didn't, you didn't. It just wasn't a big thing because there wasn't a tremendous amount of high level scouting all over us in the 70s and early 80s. Just didn't have a lot of that. And matter of fact, when I ended up going to play college basketball right out of high school, and I chose to play tennis when I got there. I wasn't going there for that. I didn't know until like I don't know. I think it was March of my senior year. Then a coach said, "Hey, we'd love to have you come play for us." I'm like, "Hey, okay." It just was a different time, right? But today, you got 6-year-olds being told by their mom and dad, "Hey, if you don't do this right, you're never going to get to college." So automatically, things have changed. So that kid can't be sloppy and messy, and it's not their fault. We don't give them the freedom to actually learn. Learning the what people don't understand, the mistakes. It's not just that the kid and all of us figure out and we get to give feedback and try to correct it. Well, the mistakes actually has a neural component to it. When the body knows what you're trying to do, like with the brain, it's been given an instruction. We know that the kid knows it. He saw you or she saw you do the exercise. They get it. But because they don't have a written motor program in their brain yet, to them, it's like first time on a bike. It's wobbly and it's misdirected, and they're trying to go straight, but they just can't do it yet. Give them a week, and then all of a sudden, they're waving to their friend. Be better. That's not how it works. The brain has to clean up a motor pathway that's very clear, like a big highway. Boom, it just goes quick. Because early on, it's just a jagged mess, and the impulse of information can't get through very
Yeah.
good. So that's the science behind it, and we can't fight that. So that's why I always say it's a messy process, and the more messy it is, the more the brain has to roll its sleeves up and say, okay, I got this 9-year-old trying to learn how to do this skill. Let's get to work. And we just don't let it happen. But again, I think it was easier because when I first started teaching and coaching way back, we didn't worry about the kids making mistakes. We expected it. That was part of it. Now we're so afraid. Oh my gosh, my sixth grader the college coach is gonna skip right over them. Like, what are you doing? They're not. Nobody's looking. So that's, I think, part of the problem.
Yeah, it's almost like either coaches or parents, like they just don't give athletes, young athletes especially, the time to just figure it out on their own, and they're so quick to
Yeah.
cue, which I think just again, like you said, it disrupts the whole learning process, if not makes it longer or just messes it up altogether. And I think a lot of kids
Yeah.
and that's where I think getting into, like just outside of like organized sports and practices and things that are pre-scheduled for kids, they're not doing much outside of that to when we were kids, and I was probably similar upbringing to yours. Like I had a neighborhood full of boys, and we'd go out after school and we'd make up games, and we'd run around, we'd tackle each other, and we would just figure it out. Like we would go out and play. And then I think that's where athleticism is built, like on the playgrounds, on a pickup field, where things are not ideal and predisposed. And, and one of the things that I love hearing you talk about also is like the whole problem solving skills that sports provide, like getting into an argument and figuring out how to get beyond the argument and play the game. Like that doesn't happen anymore. Like kids, they blow up because of a simple, like, oh, the ball was out. No, the ball was in. And it's like, these kids are not capable. So I think there's so many inherent values that sports provide. But if we as parents, we don't allow that process to happen, both from a physiological standpoint, from a social standpoint, like we're crippling the kids in their development. So
Yeah. Oh God, you nailed it on that. And that's so, so important. And what you just said is a cornerstone of long-term athletic development. One of the issues that I had back when, many countries have done it. Canada did a great job, obviously, with their long-term athletic development model. And there's many other countries that have done a really good job. But, Canada was one that really put definitions and timeframes and all. And I've always been on board with all this stuff. The only issue I've had sometimes is that we've pinholed it into this structure of how it goes versus allowing it to happen naturally at certain stages, just like you said. Bunch of you boys probably went to each day. You probably went to somebody else's backyard or met in a park or on the street in the concrete. We played the stuff we did. I'm surprised I still have teeth. And so it's like,
yep.
I mean, we just did stuff that, now parents are like, oh my gosh, you're going to get hurt. I'm like, my goodness, if you would have known what we did, the stuff we went through and the contraptions we made. But that stuff was pure athleticism. You had to solve the problem really fast, or you're probably going to end up, getting injured. So you solve things, and that's a big part.
Yeah, so outside of like maybe in the context of sport, obviously a lot of the audience that I speak to and communicate with are coaches and other, whether it be strength coaches, skill coaches, what have you. Talk about how we can build in more of that problem solving and like ultimately that creativity within the training environment, like the formal training environment, much like you and I are exposed to on a regular basis.
Yeah. So I think there's a really big push now on what, there's a phrase out there called constraint-led approach to training or small-sided games. Well, when I trained young kids, I think off camera we were talking a little bit about different age athletes and all. And I have a couple young athletes that I work with, two sisters, and they're elementary age. And so I'll just give an example of creativity is I'll teach them how to do a lunge. One of the nights we taught them how to do a lunge. And I just said, okay, guys, girls, this is what the lunge looks like. This is how it goes. How many different directions can you do a lunge? Ready, go, boom. And then they'd front lunge, and then they would try a side lunge, lose their balance a little bit. I said, okay, figure it out. How can you do that and not fall off that? And we did a few other, things like that. So, and then I would demonstrate again. I said, what if you tried it this way? And I said, and I demonstrated again, and then they went off and did it again. And now they're pretty good at lunging in all directions. They can do like a bowler like a bowler squat, that kind of stuff. They can do the front, the side, the angle. So I didn't give them too much information. I let their eyes copy me, and then I said, go and do it. And then I would talk to them a little bit. I said, what if, I said, I notice every time you guys lunge, you like to lunge and you're way up on the toes. I said, what if you did it flat foot? What would that feel like? And they did it, and they were really stable because they had now a full foot contact and they could do it. So, Mickey, that's a way that, like in the weight room, I can still not dominate the performance, but what I like to call guided discovery. I'm just kind of helping them.
Yeah.
I'm kind of not really holding their hand, but I'm kind of got them by the back of the shirt a little bit. I'm kind of lifting them up and saying, okay, think about this, but I'm not giving them the answers. I'm just kind of helping them. And so now when we're doing our footwork drills, and let's say I'm teaching them to, read something and react. Those little Z balls or agility balls, and they bounce. We do those a lot. I do those a lot because they have to solve the problem as soon as it hits. And so I do a lot of things like that. And then I just give them input on little things that they need to do to make sure, like if I think something they're doing is going to cause them a little bit of knee pain, we'll fix that right off. I won't let them do stuff like that. But for the most part, we really try to let them have the ability to own the session.
Mm-hmm.
My job is to guide them, but they have to own it because I'm not always going to be there with them, and I want them to have ownership. And then as they get older, if they were high school kids getting ready to go play in college, okay, now I got to make sure they know how to front squat or whatever. It doesn't matter the exercise, but they got to be pretty good because now a college coach might want to take them on, So that's kind of how I do it with the younger kids to make sure we're still giving them freedom to learn and make mistakes, but not putting them in danger.
Yeah, and it's kind of one of my next questions is I've heard you say a lot about how like the importance of play and competing in the training process, and you almost use that as like an assessment tool, right? And giving them a scenario, right? Giving them a couple points, coaching points, and then letting them figure out, and then through that learning experience and through that game or whatever that small-sided game you talk about is you're using that lens through which you're watching them, whether it's videotape or just visually, like you're kind of letting them do their thing. And then through the visual standpoint, like you're seeing where their deficiencies are and how you're, using that information to say, okay, let's break it down. Let's start, talk a little bit about how you use that as your assessment in terms of maybe correctives or how you're programming strength or any limiting factors within their, just movement competency.
Yeah, 100%. So like, how else do I know what they know and don't know until I make them make decisions? Or not make them, but allow them to make decisions. Okay. So if we do, a lot of my assessments is I'll just let them go. I'll tell them, okay, I want to see you do a lateral shuffle, and sometimes I'll put down cones or lines, and I said, just shuffle through there, and they'll look at me like, what do you mean? I said, defensively, how would you move? I just try not to give them a lot of information right off. I want to see them solve the problem, and so I'll let them go. And I know the difference between them being like confused to what I want them to do and what their body is allowing them to do. So when I put them in a scenario, it could be a reactive situations. If I have multiple athletes, I'll partner them up. So you and I could be partners, and I'll say, okay, you guys are going to do a mirror drill. You're going to shuffle laterally. Mickey goes first. I follow. When you go, I go, and I have to match your movements. Okay, so I'm assessing the movements. I'm seeing how they do it. And it lets me know, okay, what can they really do? Like, what's their capabilities and what's their limitations? And I don't have to say it to them. I don't have to do it. I just fit it right into the program when we start training those things that they need. So by using that approach, it allows me to recognize, and this takes a little bit of time. I've been at it long enough now. I can tell if it's the three things I'm usually looking for when I'm assessing someone. Is it a biomechanical issue? Like, are they just able or unable to hit positions? Like if they jump, can they hit the right position to use their arms and stuff? Is it a skill acquisition issue? Do they just not have that skill yet? Or is it a strength issue, strength or power? So it usually fits into one of those three. Now there's other deeper ones, psychological, but I'm not worried about that usually right off. So if I take an athlete and I have them perform a skill and I notice, man, they really stick hard on change of directions. Like they can't. It's almost like they sink into mud and they can't push off to change directions quickly. Well, is that a strength issue? Probably. It's a good chance of that. Or is it a skill acquisition? Do they not know how to change directions? And in my mind, I'm like, these kids have played tag with their friends and they've done something. They know how to change direction. Or is it, a biomechanical issue? Yeah, it could be. Could be that. Maybe they're not hitting it, but it's probably a strength issue, right? So it just feeds my next programming that I'm going to do with them. So my assessment is a way for me to decide what they know. What do they know? What can they do? And then I just build a program from there. Then I start putting it together. And sometimes, and here's something that hopefully this helps, your listeners is, what if you work with teams? If I have, a soccer team and I have varsity JV together and we're training, that's a lot of boys or girls. So I'm not going to program specifics for every single kid all the time, and that's okay. But I can look overall at the team and like, man, as a team, we kind of lack team speed. So we're going to work speed, but maybe I have three incredibly fast athletes. Well, it certainly doesn't hurt them to continue training speed, but the ones who need it get the benefit of it. So that's how you can manage from private training, one-on-one, to groups. You don't have to worry if somebody's already good at it and you don't want to repeat that. No, no, no. I always use this example. Steph Curry's a 90-something% foul shooter. Doesn't mean he doesn't keep practicing foul shots. He keeps that pattern clean. Or take the best hitters in baseball. They don't stop hitting, just because they're right now they're hitting 320, right? They still groove that pattern. So yeah.
Yeah. So it's almost like you're using that assessment on a day-to-day basis and constantly assessing where they're at, and then it just allows you to continue to evolve and elevate and progress your training with them on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis. So you're always kind of meeting them where they're at. I love it.
Yes.
Love it.
Yep.
So like you've talked about, creating the athlete beyond the athlete, right? Like I think when we look at strength coaches, we're kind of prioritizing, the big physical attributes: speed, power, strength, conditioning, like, any of those physical abilities. We could list off a bunch, but
yep.
A lot of what you've talked about is like so much of what we need or what we're lacking is building beyond that. Right. And I think that's where putting them in situations where they can play and improvise and problem solve and do all those things. Like, so as athletes advance, and, you kind of touched on it earlier, right? Like with your more advanced athletes, you start to, you continue to use your movement and play as assessments. At what point are you looking at development from, hey, I need to now start giving this athlete a little bit more strength, adaptations? I think you said as like they start specializing, getting into more advanced levels. Like, talk us a little bit more about when and how you might potentially integrate that into your training process.
Yeah, so kind of getting them stronger and to improve. Here's the great thing about this, and I get this question probably as much as anything when I'm dealing with the youth population, is when do we start strength training? When should we do it? And I've always been the type, because my daughters, they're both, one of them's going to be 27 and the other one's 24, and they started doing what we call strength training, but it was different when they were really little.
Yeah.
When they're like 6-7 years old, they started doing things. But again, it's like doing push-ups on parallettes. So they're like this, they're going like 4 inches down and real easy. And then they would see me doing some kind of an Olympic lift during my lunch break. They would be watching a little, and they'd go grab a PVC pipe and start trying to mimic me. And then so they wanted to learn it. So I would start. This is my advice. I would start the process of teaching them the coordination of doing various strength training movements, because we really only have a few. We've got the hip bending, the knee bending, the push pull, vertical, horizontal, that stuff that we all know. Well, why not give it to these kids when they're young and do it in a very safe manner, and make sure we do bilateral and unilateral, and make sure we do it, parallel stance, staggered stance, wide stance, narrow stance. Do all these things, give them such a huge warehouse. So again, I'm going back to you and your buddies playing with you. All that play built your warehouse of movement options way before a lot of other kids who didn't have that opportunity or didn't do that. So when I start strength training with my kids, what I want them to do, number one, is have an appreciation of the coordination that goes into strength training. Okay. Just to do a push up, that's hard. Even if I'm doing an easier one, like from their knees or on an angle, well, there's a coordinated pattern. I got to make sure that I have really good movement, and I don't go real in depth with them, but just teaching that. I love taking young kids, take a young, not a young, but a light dumbbell or something. I mean, literally 3 pounds, 4 or 5 pounds, and just teaching them to be able to press, hold it. Now do something. Give me a squat. Give me a lunge. Give me a walk. Do something. That's a coordinated pattern that teaches them to be able to execute this lower body movement, but still find proprioceptive vertical. Because if they're holding it in the right position, it's pretty easy. Now, if they hold it out like this, it's going to feel really heavy because they're fighting gravity. But if they get in line with the vertical axis, it's easy to do. So I'll do a lot of things like that with them. That's a form of strength training. And then as they start to age, then we start saying, okay, you want to cut faster, land better, jump better. Acceleration's a big thing. And we're talking getting a great jump as a base stealer, taking off for a 50-50 ball in soccer or basketball or rugby or whatever. I don't care the sport. That's the initial starting speed is strength. It's power. Can I generate force on a single leg to start accelerating, and then it becomes more power based, and then eventually it becomes elastic when we get up to speed? Well, let's strength train. Let's get them strong enough to do that. Let's teach them how to step up or single leg squat so they can do things like that. And then we can tighten up the details. We can tighten up the techniques as they start to get better. But I'll tell you one thing, Mickey, believe me, I go back and forth on this because I'm just a fan of strength training. I love it. I think there's just so much value in it. I think we have to be careful of understanding how much strength do we need relative to the athleticism the athlete needs to perform, because we've seen a lot of athletes, and I'm sure you have, that are kind of gangly. They're long. They don't look real strong. They don't look like they can do a lot, but man, they got like a gun for an arm, or they can really run really good. Doesn't mean they don't need strength training, but they have pretty good functional strength as it is. So I think one of my things that I'm really getting into too is making sure that strength has a really good grasp of the transverse plane. Like I did it today. I was telling you, I had a baseball player this morning, and we did some, band presses, and he had to do it with a lunge, and he's pressing on a pretty heavy band, and he had to rotate because of the fascial tissues and stuff like that. So my little kids get stuff like that in a kind of a play-like manner, and then we start to tighten it up as I get to my higher level athletes, and just make sure that they can produce force, absorb force, and then gradually be able to do it at different paces.
Yeah, I like that, because I think I get that question asked so many times from parents. So I have a 7-year-old boy who I'm the head coach of his baseball team, and parents are always coming up to me because they know what I do for a living, and they're and then I have middle schoolers, and so these parents, and it's like, well, when do you recommend starting this, and when do you recommend starting this? I'm like, well, they can train. It's just what we're prioritizing and the things that we're doing. It's different from age to age. Like at the end of the day, we want to build athleticism, and that's exposure to as many sports and movements and things as possible, and that's organized and disorganized. Like let them go out and play. But then I think, I think all my girls will come in and they'll do squats and things like that, and it's like, well, that's part of a training program, but it shouldn't be the nuts and bolts of it, right? Like at the end of the day, like that's most of it should be play. Most of it should be movement based, exposing them through movement patterns, games, things like that. And then, as you said, using that as the assessment tool to say, all right, well, you struggle to you're lacking power, like you're lacking strength. So let's do this. And like you said, squat them, you can lunge them in different planes. And I definitely agree with you, like from controlling transverse planes, like usually kids, they're really good at going in a straight line. And as soon as you start getting them and deviating from that, And I think that's the big differentiator between, like you look at people who talk about just like straight line speed or track and field, and you can't really compare track and field to like a field sport athlete because they're two very different
That's right.
things. Um,
Yep.
so talk a little, I mean, I know that's something where like, that's where your specialty is in terms of building like sport specific and team sport speed. Talk a little bit about how, like in your experience, like the big key differentiators between, I think a lot of people think of speed like as they apply it to like a 100-meter runner,
Yeah.
right? How is that
Yeah.
different to how we're applying speed to someone like a soccer player or field hockey or lacrosse or baseball?
Yeah. Yeah. And so from a young age, when they're first starting out, even if it's a young, elementary kids going out for track, for their fun, having fun going in track, not a lot of difference between the track and the softball and soccer and all that. But as we get up there, track sprinting people don't realize how detailed sprinting
Mm-hmm.
becomes if you want to reach your maximal
Yeah.
potential and your maximal speeds. You got to be really picky on your gait cycle. Well, I don't have to be overly picky for my first baseman, and who's going to run the base, because he or she, even when they're running the base, they're never really just going straight line for very long. There's always some curve component to it. Do they benefit from straight sprinting? Absolutely, because there's a lot of benefits from pure sprint training. I have a 6 week program I've shared for years, really simple. And I share it with all these athletes and parents and pro athletes. And I'm like, do it and just keep repeating the thing. And it's amazing the results, because it builds great feet, elastic. There's this big phrase now we talk about is gaining stiffness, right? It's a big thing we talk about now. Well, stiffness just means, can I absorb that force and get rid of it really fast? Well, if I have stiffer tendons, yeah, I can. So sprinting helps with that for sure, and it definitely expresses it, and it helps the connection of the hip and the core and how it works across your body to the opposite arm and shoulder. So tremendous value. But if I'm working with field court sport type athletes, I'm just not going to get as picky. I want to make sure they're good at accelerating. A track athlete can come out of the blocks and not be concerned with anything else around them. They don't have to worry about somebody cutting in front of them or a ball coming or whatever. And they actually can tunnel vision themselves, and they can not even look up for like the first 6 steps if they can do that. We can't do that in other sports. So that changes my mechanics. You mentioned the sport soccer. Well, a lot of times when they're running, there's contact while they're running. I mean, they're shoulder to shoulder with somebody else and they're fighting for space or a 50-50 ball. Yeah, we can develop the raw speed, but the minute they get in a game, what helps helps or hurts the speed, depending on which way you look at it, is their decision making, their ability to make a decision to accomplish that task at that moment. I don't have to worry about that in track. My only task is, can I run as fast as I can and get to that finish line as quick as I can? But that's not the case in soccer or field hockey or whatever. I have to accomplish something. So when we start looking at development, what are the big rocks of sprinting? Creating force, having good, fundamental mechanics, basic good mechanics, being able to transition from acceleration to max velocity and just be able to do that. Even if I don't ever get there in that particular sport, if I'm training it, I want to be able to do that. But then when I get in the sport of track and field, or let's say I was trained, because I've trained a lot of kids for like the 60
Mm-hmm.
to get
Yep.
tested in baseball. Okay, that's even a little different than football in the 40, because you got that extra 20 yards. Now you're upright. So now can we teach them how to run tall and step over and control the arm mechanics and where their arm space is and stuff like that? Don't have to worry about that with a 6th grader learning to play soccer. I just got to give them the good fundamentals and do some good things and make them compete.
Yeah.
Make them compete against somebody else. Go race, because that's going to show us a lot of what they might need.
Yeah, and I think that gets back to our previous point of like that process can be messy for some kids, and you got to give them and give them the opportunity to be exposed to high velocity. And that's where the competition in the training setting really helps, right? Whether it's with another person or running through timers or things like that. I think if you're not capable of giving the athletes that level of competition or play, or in some ways just pushing them, like they're going to miss that. And over time, just continually building back the proficiency. So yeah. And I want to touch on one of the things you talked about, like in terms of like joint stiffness and things like that. And I think that's where most young athletes are really lacking. You look at most young athletes when I assess like sprinters, and even from like maybe elementary to middle school, because it's like the developmental ages and like where they're at from a maturity standpoint, it's so varied from athlete to athlete. And so you look at a lot of them, and that level of the ability to, create stiffness when their foot hits the ground and push off and keep from an elastic standpoint and reactive standpoint, they just struggle. And there's really not many things out there that's going to develop those qualities other than sprinting. So although we're not trying to build track runners, I think there's not much else that can replace like top speed sprinting or exposing them to that, physiological adaptation. And I think that's where, if we're over prioritizing strength too early and like jumping and all that, like stuff like that, like power. And that's where I think we can really create a good training environment for kids in terms of building that long-term athletic development. So.
Oh yeah. I made a post several years ago, and I called sprinting, the food version of a superfood.
Yep.
Sprinting is a superfood. It just, it goes across all ages and abilities and level. It just adds so much value, even as we age. If you can do it healthy wise, if you don't want to go out and haven't sprinted in 20 years and go run a 40, you'll end up in a hospital bed with hamstring pulls and everything else. But yeah, I think with kids, we always got to remember, and this is the thing, if we delay developing the speed at which their central nervous system develops and responds to stressors, we're doing a big disadvantage. That's why I'm a huge fan. When they're young, do things that, even if they're not like that individual's not fast, that young kid, do things that make them work at maximal speeds on a lot of things. Even like I'll do medicine ball throws with them, and I'll tell them, what I'll do is I'll put down, like they'll throw a couple out there. I say, okay, you're throwing it right here. Here's my foot. Your job this time, can you get that ball past my foot as fast as possible? Well, what am I doing? I'm trying to increase their power output, right? That's all I'm doing. But to them, it's like, all right, I can see how fast I can get it there, And so they're trying to chest pass it as fast. Well, I'm trying to get their central nervous system to ramp up as fast as I can. That's the same thing I do with sprinting. I'm like, I'll start talking to him. I said, what if you tried to sprint and you stayed, let's say you're 4'10", and you tried to make yourself 5 foot tall when you ran. So I'm just trying to get them to don't squat down, don't have a long ground contact, try to get taller. And then over time, they start to get better at that kind of stuff. That's a mechanical thing. That's a skill acquisition and a technical thing they can start to develop. But what it's doing too, because they're sprinting more times, is they're developing that stiffness and that ability to absorb and release that force. And then we can do stuff with them where, like an isometric calf raise, or a half, we can do fun stuff like that. How I do that stuff, because that stuff sucks sometimes. It's like no fun to do. Even I do it for myself still, and I hate it. So what I'll do, I have this little trampoline. I can throw balls off, So I'll stand in front of that. I'll get in a split squat, and I'll kind of lift my heel up, and I'll do like 20 chest passes. It's just because my brain, I'm like Dr. Seuss. I gotta be doing something with it. But that's what I'll do with the kids. I don't even tell them I'm trying to do an isometric thing with their life. I just say, okay, get in a split squat, see if you can get your heel off the ground, and see how many chest passes you can get in 10 seconds or something like that. That gives them the chance to kind of develop it. But yeah, getting back to that sprinting just solves so many problems. And when they go through the growth spurt, the technical aspect of that will get a little bit screwed up. That's just the growth. Okay, that's everything kind of getting longer. But the fact that they've gone through it, when they get to the other side of that growth spurt, man, they're going to be really good. They'll be ready to take off again.
Yeah. And And I think
Nope,
that's
I'm not
okay.
done.
And it's funny because like I think sprinting, you could relate it to any other like super technical movements, like swinging a club or throwing a baseball or swinging a baseball bat. Like I said, my 7-year-old, his team, like I'm the coach. So when we hit, I'm like, look, the sole goal here is like, I just want you to swing the bat as hard as you can. Like we'll clean, like the stuff will clean up. I'm not going to tell you how to swing because you're not going to, like, your central nervous system doesn't care what I have to say. Like
Yeah.
I'm just going to, I'm literally trying to throw the ball to hit your barrel, but just swing hard. So, and,
Yep.
and, and somebody, had made a comment, well, this kid's got a bit of an uppercut. I'm like, who cares? He's swinging the bat hard. When he connects, he
That's
sends it further
right.
than anybody on the team. So I'm not going to touch that because as he gets older, I can't win back that speed game. Like we have to set that now.
Exactly.
And so I think that's where
Amen.
coaches, like maybe just having a little better context in terms of how to go about coaching young kids without, I don't
Yeah.
want to say mess them up because like has a very negative connotation, but
Yeah.
and you said it earlier, like you're limiting their potential, right? And I think that's where something that like the goal of this conversation is that maybe giving coaches who, and at the youth age, we're dealing with a lot of dads. And I had a conversation with a friend of mine the other day, and it's like, look, a lot of these guys are fathers and they have other responsibilities.
Yeah.
And so they're volunteering their time much like I am. So I respect that. So I don't say much, but I also try to help out when I can. And that's why, if I
Yeah.
have the opportunity to coach, whether it's my 7-year-old son or my 11-year-old daughters, I'm going to do it because I know what I can provide is much better than what's
That's right.
available there. So, hopefully, I think the more we can create context and opportunities for other coaches who might not have the background like you and I have, I think just giving them
Yeah. Yeah.
other ways of approaching this would really go a long way in terms of helping some of these young kids in their early on development and ultimately get more fun and enjoyment out of the sport, which is what the most important thing is when we're looking at young kids.
That's right. And we have to, and this is so hard. And it's funny, Mickey, I took over this basketball program 2.5 years ago, where it's a high school boys basketball program. I got involved. AD asked me, the head coach had left that was there, and I took it over. And when I took that program, I started even with the young kids, the youth program, kind of the feeder system. And everyone, when I first got in, the first thing they said, "Oh, when are we doing the AAU and we're doing the travel?" And I just backed them all down and I said, listen, I'm not a fan of it for various
Mm-hmm.
reasons. There's a lot of good things with travel sports and so many benefits that can be. I said, I just think right now we're misguided as to how to run it. Like it's too much of everything. And I said, if we gear down. So anyway, I showed them my model and my system, how we do things and what we did. So, the one thing I kept telling them, stop judging your kids or the other kids on the team and me and my team on wins and losses for a little bit. Eventually, when they get up to my level, if we're losing to everybody and we're not doing very well, I'm obviously did something wrong. When I got 17, 18-year-old boys here, we should be better if my system has any merit to it. Well, what I was trying to explain to them is, listen, if I could probably do some things with the young kids and win games that we shouldn't win, but it would stunt their development. Like I could play a zone and trap full court with fourth graders and do all that stuff. I said, we're going to win despite the fact that we're not very good, just because the other kids don't know how to handle that. And I said, so my whole point is, when we're dealing with young kids, we have to give them permission to learn as much as we give them permission to fail. We've got to do that's so important. And people think, oh, that's just your, coach speak. You're just giving us the old story. I said, you don't understand how important that is, because the minute your kid has a fear of making a mistake, and this is why I pushed back on AAU so much. I said, they're playing so much, but what happens, what you don't understand, there's a difference between them playing with me in my practice setting against another team when nobody's there to judge them, versus going to an AAU where you just pay $20 to go in and watch, and the officials, not paying attention during the game, and the parents are yelling and the coaches are yelling. That's a different environment. Now your kid's afraid to make a mistake because of the environment. That doesn't happen. I don't let that happen in my practice. So your kids are free to challenge their left hand, or let's say baseball. Maybe they're willing to try a double play and flip the ball. You're teaching them to be quicker with it, as where in a game they don't want to make a mistake. It's almost like they want to run it over to the bag because they don't get an error. You got to let them experiment. And if we don't, their ceilings to being a great player will probably come down quite a bit just because they never were allowed to experience. And it's all fear, Mickey. It's not that they don't have the potential, the fear that the parents and the surrounding cast of friends and parents and other parents and coaches put on these kids. Now they don't want to do it. You and your friends playing in the yard didn't give two craps about what anybody said. You just played and you tried things and you had fun and went home and did it again the next day.
Yeah, I love that because I think it's almost like part of coaching is putting athletes in a situation where you have to challenge them, and by through that challenge they figure out how to they figure out a new strategy. They figure out like what their limitations are. But you also have to give them the grace that if they fail and mess up, like that's part of, again, learning a skill is messy, right? You have to give them the opportunity and the runway to fail, and then give them the context and feedback to say, all right, yeah, and you touched on it earlier, like, hey, when you did this, maybe try this way, and maybe this might be a little bit, you might get a better outcome, and not giving them the answers, but help guiding them that way. And I think that's where I think, yeah, it's very challenging, and I think you don't get that when you have a stands full of parents, screaming, "Throw the ball here, run here," and it's just kids. They shut down, they become fearful, and again, they take the fun out of it. And I think that's it's.
I know. Well, I was thinking it's almost like every kid, even they have to make a youth level of this banana ball.
They do.
The game. Like, let the kids go out and play. I mean, it's funny because they do these crazy things there, but it's like, but you know what? It's the way so I took over a soccer. My son, when we first moved down here, was playing soccer at this rec league, and they needed coaches. Mm-hmm. So my wife signed me up, and so I went and coached. But I'm telling you, man, Mickey, I had more fun with these kids. I came up with just fun, competitive 3-on-1 competitions, but the offensive team could only use one foot. Like they couldn't use their dominant foot and stuff like that. And it was funny because I started to get parents staying. Like parents would normally drop them off, hey, we'll be back in an hour. They started to stay to watch the things we were doing. And the kids had a great time because the kids would go home and tell the parents, like, oh, man, this is great. This is fun. But they were getting really, really good at this stuff. But I didn't make it like silly and, sloppy on purpose. I just put them in situations where they had to learn in it, and it caused them to figure things out. And one thing I try to tell dads and moms and youth coaches is there's two things as kind of like overseers of youth sports we have to do. We got to help kids with decision making and problem solving because they're different. Problem solving takes a little longer. It's collaborative. It's you and I figuring out, okay, what do we do here? How can we, let's try this, let's try that. Decision making sometimes is subconscious. It happens so fast. It's just, and it comes from experience. Well, how do we do that? You got to give them more experience. Put them in those situations. And then we can actually improve decision making and problem solving together by, you might say, hey guys, all right, here you go. You got 2 soccer balls. You've only got this grid this big. You got 10-yard grid to play within, and you got one goalie, and you got to score against that with both soccer balls. Mm-hmm. Well, the goalie has a lot of decision making going on. The people with the soccer balls are problem solving. How do we do this? How do we make this work? That is gold in the nervous system and the memory of these young kids. So the more we do stuff like that, and dads and moms stop being so like, well, that's not how I was watching the Yankees the other day and they were doing this. I mean, that's the Yankees, that's so I think stuff like that really helps the kids.
Yeah. And I think that's getting back to like, that's where they're not getting that. Yes, they might get an extent of problem solving and, figuring things out and just, in a game, like a true game, but there's consequences, right? And I think that's where if we can, in the training world, in the training environment, create those, small-sided games, and that, like you said, the constraints-led approach where, hey, we're setting them up in situations where they have to like figure this stuff out, problem solve, decision making, but the stakes are so low, right? Like we're going to just
Yeah.
play it again. And then, no, there's no judgment. There's like, hey, we're all here to get better. Like that everybody's going to fail, expect to fail. Like, but through the failing process, you're going to learn and figure things out and you're going to get better. And I think that's the one thing that I see is, we're spending too much time in too many games that have too many like high stakes. And, and then if the kids don't compete, the parents at the end of the game are like, well, why didn't you do this in this scenario? And it's like, no, like that's not the way it should be. Like for me, I've completely, with my son, like at the end of the game, we go home, we get ice cream. Like I don't talk about baseball in the car. I don't say anything about the game. And like this year has been a much better experience for both of us. Whereas like last year, like, he was young. I think he's physically more mature than most kids his age. So I think psychologically I expected more out of him, and I completely reversed the way I thought of things. And so I think that's something where we just have to give kids the opportunity to be kids, right? and have situations where like it's our job to parents is to put them in the situations where they can be kids and thrive and figure out all this stuff in a low stakes settings where there is no consequences other than, I get to try it again. And what's the worst that can happen? I mess up. Right.
That's right. That's right. And that's when there's been researchers who have talked to kids, like sports psychologists or whatever, talked to kids who decided to no longer play sports, like when they were, middle school age or early high school. Usually a lot of the responses, that's what it was. Like it just wasn't any fun anymore. I didn't like being told I was bad, or I didn't like, the anticipation of it. They make a bad play in the first inning or the first quarter of a game. They know in the back of their head they got that whole game to think about that, because when they go home, when they get in the car, they're going to get it. And that's, it's one thing I can't remember who said this. Maybe you know, but there was somebody who said, and I've talked to this to my parents, and I say it a lot with my kids now. It's like after a game, man, I loved watching you play.
Yeah.
Man, it was fun watching you play. Even if they had a bad game, my son sometimes is hard on himself. He goes, I wish I would have did this. I'm like, I know, man, that stinks when that stuff happens. But hey, hey, that was fun, man. Did you try though? That was good. And so you kind of change the narrative for them that's what's important is, are you trying? Are you having a good time? And, and this is the other thing I will say. That doesn't mean we still don't have, as parents, the responsibility of, if let's say our kid went out there and screwed around and goofed off and was
different.
Disrespectful, didn't work hard. Yeah. But hey, all bets are off at that point. I'm like, hey, you know what? You owe your coach and your teammates the responsibility of doing your job. If you had an error or a mistake, no problem at all. But man, you better not have a bad attitude or not hustle. That's where we have to, because that's a life lesson.
Yeah, I think that's a very good distinction, and I believe in that 100%. And I think it's like I tell my kids, like, control the things you can control. Like, I'm not going to get on you about things that you can't control. But yeah, that's a different conversation. But for me, like, I'd make it a point where we get in the car and I'll tell my son, like, hey, this was the best part of my day to come out and coach with you. And so like, and he knows it. And like my actions are such that he understands. And so, and I hope not just for my boy, like I hope the kids on the team are having fun and like I come up with fun nicknames for the kids and come up with like, we're playing baseball, but I have them hitting like soccer balls and things like that. And, playing soccer, baseball. And it's like, I'm sure other parents are like, what the hell's going on that field? And it's like, well, they're having fun. They're all developing some level of skill and they want to continue to play. And if that's the case, then I feel like I'm doing a good job. So.
That's right. Mickey, I want to mention one thing, because it went right when you said that, this clicked on me many years ago. So I would study a lot of the top Olympic programs, whether it was ours or somebody else's. And I just wanted to see what they did. So I'd look at it. Well, the head of USA men's volleyball, he was great at developing the whole system, the whole program. But the one thing he always said, and he used to say to his coaches, you never want to be a child's last
I love
coach.
that.
Meaning, did you turn them off your heart and now they just don't want to play the
Hmm.
game anymore? Now, sometimes kids they don't want to play the sport anymore, and it wasn't your fault. They just don't want to do it. But he goes, you don't want a kid to quit because of your actions and stuff. So he always tells and reminds every year, he said, I remind the coaches of that. Don't be the child's last coach because of your actions. You know what I mean? And I thought that was really powerful. And so I always try to remember that. Now, obviously, when they get older in college and high school,
Yeah.
that's just part of the deal. But yeah, it's a big one for young
Yeah, I
kids.
think that's a real profound statement, and I think it goes a long way for most coaches who are working with young kids. I think that's helps provide a little context in terms of making the main thing, and the main thing is to have fun and want them to be there on a day-to-day basis. So
definitely
love it. So just to kind of wrap this up and obviously looking at this through the lens of performance and development, by trade, I'm a strength coach. I feel like I wear a lot of other hats in that continuum, right?
Yeah.
But what if we were to kind of wrap all this stuff up and, from a tactical standpoint, because I know you talk about models and of movement and all that stuff, and maybe call it the models of coaching, right? How we should be developing young athletes. What's in your thoughts? What would be maybe the optimal way of integrating all these different components together as an athlete matures from young elementary age to maybe high school?
Yeah. So I think number one is you've got to provide environments where learning is optimal. It's going to take place, and don't be people get confused when I say optimal. That means void of mistake. No. Optimal means you're going to provide an environment where they're going to be challenged and they're going to have to solve things when mistakes happen. So what does that mean? Well, so if we provide this kind of an environment, we look at all the buckets, the speed, multi-directional speed, the strength training, the mobility, and all the things that fit into this, and then the specific skills of the various sports that they want to play. And what we want to make sure we're doing is in this environment, we have to have teaching based on learning, not the other way around. How do they learn? Well, that's how I'm going to teach. Okay, so that's really important. Yep. We have to make sure that we provide ample progression for them to be challenged and have stressors that make them a little bit uncomfortable at times. And I don't mean uncomfortable in a bad way. I mean uncomfortable with, oh man, that's harder than I thought. Well, yeah, it is. All right. What can you do about it? How are you going to solve that? And that, again, that could be if we're talking about in the strength component, we're much safer there. We're not going to put them in a bet, but it could be, throwing a medicine ball with some variety. You know what I mean? It could be that. But in the movement world, the speed and the quickness, we're providing stressors that are going to challenge their movements. And in that area, this is the important thing for people to understand. I can add a hard stress to somebody just by adding a different reaction to them, like making them having a change. I don't have to add any weight or bands or intensity. I just make it more challenging because now they're reacting to a different stimulus, and that can challenge it. But then you might notice that, hey, gosh, this guy's just not cutting really well on this one side. Every time he does a shuttle run, he just, for some reason, he can't. Well, maybe we overload them. Maybe we take a band and we charge that nervous system a little bit and try to create a little more stimulus in that muscle. And now they have to be able to become more stable to change direction. We take that thing off and now they're better at it, and over time. So if we look at the whole big, thing that we're talking about here, provide an environment where learning is going to occur, and then put the teaching in. Okay, get the teaching and figure out how they're going to learn it, and then put the teaching in there, and then add stressors. Just continually add different stressors, and a stress doesn't always have to be more weight. It can be more challenging, and there's where constraint-led approach and small-sided games. And then once we get that stuff solved, now we just start as coaches, we solve the
Yeah.
problem. It's funny. I'm sitting here looking. So this is a practice
Yeah.
plan. This is a practice plan. Well, you've probably written a lot of plans, and you get in there and you go, all right, that didn't work. That
Yep.
didn't
Yep.
work. And so you got to go in there sometimes worse problem solving, sometimes from one exercise to the next. Well, that's what I tell the kids. I'm like, all right, we tried. Let's try another one. And that's the environment we've got to allow to happen.
Yeah. Well, Lee, I love all that. And I think it's coaching in that capacity. It takes a lot of effort, right? It's not a passive thing. Like, it's a very active way of coaching. And I think that's where, you've been around a lot of great coaches, myself included. Like, I think the ones who do it really well are ones who they're always getting better. They're always looking at ways to improve their athletes. But I think they're very active about it. They don't become complacent in what they're doing and what they're learning. And I think most importantly, as you said, they're meeting their athletes where they are, much like you said, that, letting that teaching aspect, based on what and how they learn and all that. So I love it.
Yeah,
Awesome.
Definitely.
Well, Lee, this has been really special. I've really enjoyed our conversation. As I said, the conversation could have gone an infinite amount of ways based on your depth of knowledge in this field. Maybe one day we'll get you back and talk about, more the X's and O's of training and how you look at movement. But, in the meantime, if there's people who want to learn more about what you do and how you coach, how can they find you?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Mickey. This is great. I appreciate what you're doing and the stuff that you're providing for coaches and athletes and parents and everything. So thank you. And thank you for allowing me to be a guest. And but yeah, if people want to find me, I'm pretty active on social media. I try to spark controversy, not to be controversial, but to get conversation, and then we go from there. But it's stuff out there. But if anything at Lee Taft, they can pretty much find me. And then leetaft.com is kind of our, ground zero where they can go and find us and find anything that we're doing or where we're going and stuff like that. So, but yeah, I appreciate it.
Great. Well, Lee, thank you for everything. And most of all, thank you for all the work that you continue to do to push the field forward. And, you inspire so many coaches like myself, and you just make us all better and uplift us as a collective career and just overall, like, you're ahead of everybody and leading by the front. So I appreciate you.
Oh gosh, I appreciate that. So kind. I've been fortunate. I've learned from a lot of good people. So hopefully passing it on.
Yep.
So
Yep.
Thank you,
Excellent.
Mickey.
Well, thanks, Lee. We'll be in touch.
All right. Thank you.